The day my husband's family told me I deserved nothing was the same day they accidentally handed me the key to the truth. My name is Emily Carter, and for 15 years, my husband Michael and I built a life together in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. We were never flashy. We lived in a 3-bedroom house, drove practical cars, and spent our weekends grilling in the backyard or visiting local farmers markets. Michael believed in hard work, honesty, and keeping promises. That was why the scene unfolding in his parents' living room just 6 weeks after his passing felt so unreal. I sat at the end of a long oak table while his mother, Patricia, folded her hands and spoke in a calm voice that somehow felt colder than shouting. She told me that Michael's family had reviewed everything and that, since many assets had supposedly originated from family money years ago, I should not expect much. His older brother Ryan nodded as if a decision had already been finalized. His sister Lauren avoided eye contact altogether. I remember staring at the framed family photographs on the wall and wondering how people I had spent holidays with for over a decade could suddenly act like I was a stranger. No one asked how I was coping. No one asked whether I was sleeping. No one mentioned the countless nights Michael and I spent planning our future together. Instead, the conversation revolved around what belonged to whom. The more they talked, the more invisible I felt. Then Patricia leaned forward and delivered the sentence that stayed with me for days. She said, "Emily, you were Michael's wife, but some things were never really yours." The room fell silent. I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend the life we had built together. But grief had drained every ounce of energy from me. So I simply nodded and left. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Rain tapped softly against the windows. I kept replaying every detail of the meeting until a memory surfaced from somewhere deep in my mind. About a year earlier, Michael and I had been driving home from a baseball game when he casually mentioned a safe deposit box. At the time, I barely paid attention because it seemed unimportant. But now I remembered his exact words. He had smiled and said, "If anything ever happens to me, there's something important in there. Not valuable in the way people usually mean, but important." Back then I laughed and told him he sounded mysterious. He laughed too and changed the subject. I never thought about it again until that rainy evening. Suddenly my heart started racing. The next morning I searched through old files, insurance papers, and folders in our home office. Hours passed before I found a small envelope tucked inside a document organizer. On the front, written in Michael's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words, "For Emily, when needed." My hands trembled as I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. The handwriting alone felt like hearing Michael's voice again after weeks of silence. Inside was a single folded letter and a small metal key attached to a tag with a bank name printed on it. I immediately recognized the bank. It was only 15 minutes from our house, a branch we had driven past hundreds of times. I unfolded the letter carefully. The message was short. Michael wrote that if I was reading it, circumstances had probably become more complicated than he hoped. He told me not to panic, not to trust assumptions, and most importantly, not to allow anyone to pressure me into signing documents before I understood everything. Then he mentioned the safe deposit box. He wrote that the contents would explain several things he had never fully discussed because he believed there would be plenty of time in the future. Reading those words sent a chill through me. Michael was not the type of person who dramatized anything. If he had taken the time to prepare this, it mattered. The following morning I called the bank. After verifying my identity and answering several questions, I learned that an appointment would be required to access the box. The earliest available time was 3 days away. 3 days had never felt so long. During that wait, strange things began happening. Ryan called twice asking whether I had located additional financial records. Lauren sent a message asking if I planned to contest anything involving the estate. Even Patricia called, though her concern seemed focused on paperwork rather than my well-being. Each conversation left me with the same uneasy feeling. It was as though everyone was trying to figure out what I knew before I actually knew it myself. On the second evening, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I did not recognize. The man introduced himself as Thomas Reed. The name sounded familiar, and then I remembered. Thomas had worked with Michael years earlier during a business expansion project. We had not spoken in almost a decade. After offering condolences, he hesitated before saying something unusual. He asked whether Michael had ever mentioned a backup file. I told him no. Thomas grew quiet. Then he explained that several years ago Michael became concerned about certain family disagreements involving money and business interests. According to Thomas, Michael believed documentation should always exist whenever important decisions were made. Before ending the call, Thomas said something that stayed with me. He said, "Michael trusted people, Emily, but he verified everything." That night I barely slept. Questions kept racing through my mind. Why had Michael prepared the envelope? Why had he spoken to Thomas about documentation? And why did his family suddenly seem so nervous whenever financial records were mentioned? 3 mornings later, I drove to the bank under a gray Ohio sky. The key sat in my purse the entire trip. As I walked through the front doors, I felt a mixture of grief, anxiety, and determination. Whatever waited inside that safe deposit box had been placed there by Michael himself. For the first time since losing him, I felt certain that the answers I needed were finally within reach. The bank employee escorted me through a secured hallway and into a small private room furnished with a table, 2 chairs, and a soft overhead light. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a rectangular metal box and placed it in front of me. After confirming my identification one final time, she left the room and quietly closed the door. Suddenly it was just me, the key, and whatever Michael had chosen to leave behind. I took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me feared finding nothing meaningful. Another part feared finding too much. When the lock clicked open, I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and a leather notebook that immediately caught my attention because I recognized it. Michael had carried that notebook for years. He used it to write business ideas, reminders, and personal observations. Seeing it again felt strangely comforting. I opened the sealed envelope first. Inside was another letter addressed directly to me. Michael explained that if I had reached this point, it likely meant events were unfolding exactly as he feared they might. He wrote that he loved his family but had spent years navigating disagreements that most people never saw. He urged me to remain patient and to examine every document before making conclusions. Then he instructed me to review the folders in a specific order. The first folder contained financial statements, property records, and investment summaries. As I reviewed them, confusion quickly replaced grief. Several assets that Ryan and Patricia had recently described as family property had actually been purchased by Michael years after we were married. The documents were clear, detailed, and professionally organized. The second folder contained copies of emails, signed agreements, and meeting notes. Many involved family business discussions from several years earlier. Certain conversations seemed unusually tense. More than once, Michael documented disagreements about ownership percentages and financial decisions. The third folder contained something even more surprising. There were records showing that Michael had repeatedly transferred personal earnings into separate accounts that no one in the family had ever mentioned. Everything appeared completely legal and transparent, but the amounts were significant. My heart pounded as I realized that the picture being presented by his family did not match the records sitting in front of me. Then I opened the leather notebook. Several pages were marked with colored tabs. One entry from nearly 4 years earlier immediately stood out. Michael had written that he wanted a complete record of important financial matters because memories could change when money became involved. Another note mentioned concerns about pressure from certain relatives regarding future estate planning. He never accused anyone directly, but the concern was obvious. As I continued reading, I found a reference to the flash drive. Michael wrote that it contained supporting documentation and a timeline explaining why he had organized everything this way. Just as I reached for the drive, my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Ryan's name. I stared at the screen as it rang. Less than 10 minutes after opening the box, the one person who seemed most interested in the estate was suddenly calling me again. This time, the timing felt far too coincidental to ignore. I let the call ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared, followed almost immediately by a text message from Ryan asking me to call him back as soon as possible. The urgency in his message only deepened my suspicion. I slipped the phone into my purse and focused on the flash drive instead. Whatever Michael had left behind was far more important than another uncomfortable conversation. Once I returned home, I connected the drive to my laptop and opened the files one by one. The contents were organized with the same meticulous attention to detail I had seen in the safe deposit box. There were spreadsheets, scanned documents, correspondence records, and a folder labeled Timeline. When I opened it, I found a chronological summary covering nearly 7 years. Michael had documented key financial events, major business decisions, and numerous conversations involving members of his family. Nothing appeared emotional or accusatory. It read more like the work of an accountant than a husband. Dates, facts, supporting records, and references were carefully linked together. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. Several entries revealed ongoing disagreements between Michael and Ryan regarding investments and ownership. Claims. In multiple cases, Michael noted that certain statements being repeated within the family did not match official records. One section referenced a meeting that had taken place almost 3 years earlier. According to Michael's notes, Ryan had argued that certain assets should eventually remain under family control regardless of what future estate documents stated. Michael responded by documenting the conversation and preserving copies of related correspondence. Then I found something that made me stop reading entirely. Attached to one entry was a scanned letter written by Michael himself. The date was from 18 months before his passing. In the letter, he explained that if confusion ever arose concerning his estate, all original records should be reviewed before any conclusions were reached. He specifically mentioned that assumptions, family expectations, and verbal claims should never override documented facts. The language was calm, professional, and unmistakably intentional. It felt less like a precaution and more like preparation. That evening, another call arrived, this time from Patricia. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her tone sounded unusually friendly at first. She asked how I was doing and whether I needed help sorting through paperwork. Then the conversation shifted. She casually mentioned that estate matters could become complicated and suggested that family unity was more important than focusing on technical details. I listened quietly. Before ending the call, she said something that immediately caught my attention. She told me that dragging out financial questions would only create unnecessary tension. The moment the call ended, I realized something important. Nobody should have known I was reviewing financial questions at all. I had not told anyone about the safe deposit box. I had not mentioned the documents. Yet both Ryan and Patricia suddenly seemed eager to influence what happened next. Later that night, I opened the final folder on the flash drive. Inside was a file named Meeting Instructions. The first sentence made my heart race. Michael wrote that if certain events occurred after his passing, a formal review meeting would eventually become unavoidable. And when that meeting happened, he wanted every relevant document presented together in one room. For the first time since Michael passed away, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt certainty. The documents were not random records collected over the years. They were a roadmap. Michael had anticipated confusion, pressure, and competing narratives long before any of this happened. The next morning, I contacted the estate attorney handling the case and requested a formal review meeting involving all interested parties. There was a brief pause on the phone before he agreed. He sounded surprised by the request, especially when I explained that additional documentation had been discovered. Within hours, word apparently spread through the family. Ryan called again. This time I answered. His voice carried an uneasy friendliness that felt rehearsed. He asked whether I had found anything important among Michael's papers. I kept my response simple and said I was still reviewing records. Ryan quickly shifted the conversation toward moving forward and avoiding unnecessary disputes. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wanted information without revealing any of his own. After the call ended, I reviewed the files once more. One detail kept standing out. Several records showed that Michael had regularly updated ownership documentation and beneficiary designations. Everything was properly dated and professionally filed. There was nothing vague about any of it. Yet somehow his family continued acting as though the outcome had already been decided in their favor. 2 days later, the meeting was scheduled. The conference room was located in a downtown office building overlooking the city. I arrived early carrying a single briefcase containing copies of the materials from the safe deposit box and flash drive. One by one, the others entered. Patricia sat at the far end of the table with the confidence of someone expecting a routine formality. Ryan appeared calm on the surface, but he checked his phone constantly. Lauren seemed uncomfortable from the moment she arrived. The attorney opened the meeting by reviewing the estate summary that had been discussed previously. As he spoke, I noticed subtle looks exchanged between Patricia and Ryan. It was almost as if they expected everything to proceed according to a familiar script. Then the attorney paused. He explained that additional records had recently been submitted for review. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Ryan shifted in his chair. Patricia straightened her posture. The attorney began examining several of the newly presented documents while everyone watched. At first, the discussion focused on asset ownership records. Then attention turned to investment accounts. The more documentation that appeared, the less certain Ryan seemed. Several assumptions that had been repeated during earlier conversations suddenly looked far less secure. Yet the biggest surprise had not even been mentioned. The attorney eventually asked whether all discovered materials had been provided. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Then I told him there was one more item. The safe deposit box contained not only financial records but also instructions left directly by Michael. The room became completely silent. Even the attorney looked surprised. Patricia stared at me without speaking. Ryan's expression changed instantly. For the first time since this entire situation began, neither of them appeared confident. And as every eye in the room turned toward me, I realized the meeting Michael had predicted years earlier had finally begun exactly as he expected. The attorney adjusted his glasses and asked me to provide the instructions Michael had left behind. I carefully removed the folder from my briefcase and handed over the documents. Nobody spoke while he reviewed the first few pages. The silence in the room felt heavier with every passing second. Finally, he looked up and explained that Michael had created a structured process for verifying ownership, beneficiary designations, and financial records before any final conclusions regarding the estate could be reached. Patricia immediately responded that the family had already discussed most of those matters. The attorney politely interrupted and clarified that personal discussions were not the same as documented evidence. Then he continued reading. One by one, additional records were placed on the conference table. Property documents were matched against purchase records. Investment accounts were compared with beneficiary forms. Historical ownership records were reviewed alongside tax filings. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. Several assets previously described as family-controlled were in fact held under arrangements established directly by Michael. More importantly, many decisions had been updated years after those original family assumptions had been formed. Ryan remained unusually quiet. Lauren stared at the documents in front of her without saying much. Patricia occasionally attempted to explain how the family had always understood certain arrangements, but every explanation ran into the same obstacle: the paperwork said something different. Then the attorney opened another section from Michael's instructions. According to the notes, Michael anticipated that confusion could arise because some relatives were relying on outdated information. He specifically directed that the most recent signed records should take precedence over verbal expectations. Hearing those words read aloud changed the atmosphere entirely. This was no longer a disagreement based on opinions. It was becoming a review of facts. The attorney then reached a document that had not previously been discussed. It was a summary prepared by Michael himself less than 2 years before his passing. In it, he listed major assets, account structures, and intended beneficiaries. Everything was organized with remarkable detail. As the attorney reviewed the summary, I noticed Ryan's confidence slowly fading. The assumptions he had repeated for weeks were being contradicted by document after document. Yet the most significant discovery had not arrived. Near the end of the folder was a sealed instruction page that Michael had specifically directed to be opened only during a formal estate review. The attorney carefully broke the seal and began reading silently. His expression changed almost immediately. He read the page a second time before placing it on the table. Everyone leaned forward. Patricia asked what it said. The attorney took a slow breath before answering. He explained that Michael had referenced additional supporting evidence stored separately from the documents already provided. According to the instruction page, this evidence contained the complete history behind several disputed financial matters and would help explain why he had gone to such extraordinary lengths to preserve records. Then came the sentence that stunned the room. Michael had written that before any final estate distribution could occur, the additional evidence should be reviewed in its entirety because it would reveal information that some family members might prefer remained hidden. The room fell silent once again. For the first time, nobody seemed interested in speaking. Everyone was thinking the same thing. What exactly had Michael discovered before he died, and why had he been so certain that the truth would eventually need to come out? The meeting ended without any final decisions, but nobody left the room feeling the same way they had when they arrived. What had started as a routine estate discussion had become something entirely different. Michael's records were steadily dismantling assumptions that had been treated as facts for weeks. As people gathered their belongings, Ryan approached the attorney and attempted to continue the conversation privately. The attorney politely declined and explained that any future discussions concerning the estate would need to remain fully documented and transparent. That response seemed to frustrate him. Meanwhile, Patricia barely spoke at all. The confidence she had displayed during previous meetings had been replaced by visible uncertainty. Later that afternoon, the attorney contacted me directly. He explained that after reviewing Michael's instructions, he believed additional materials should be collected before the next formal session. According to the documents, Michael had designated a secure archive containing records that extended beyond the files already discovered. The archive was maintained by an independent accounting firm that had worked with him for years. Apparently, Michael had arranged for the contents to be released only if specific conditions were met. The attorney informed me that those conditions had now been satisfied. 2 days later, a package arrived at his office. Inside were dozens of pages of records, correspondence summaries, transaction histories, and professional reviews prepared by third parties. The volume of material alone was remarkable. Michael had not simply preserved information. He had built an entire system designed to verify it. During the next review session, the attorney began presenting key findings. Several independent reports confirmed ownership structures that matched the documents from the safe deposit box. Additional records revealed that Michael had repeatedly sought professional guidance whenever disagreements arose regarding family finances. In every case, he documented recommendations and preserved supporting evidence. Then one particular report changed everything. It summarized a series of events from several years earlier involving disputed claims about certain investment contributions. According to the report, multiple family members believed they held larger financial interests than official records supported. Michael had anticipated future confusion and ordered a comprehensive review at the time. The conclusions were clear. Many assumptions being repeated within the family had never been supported by actual documentation. As the attorney explained the findings, Ryan became increasingly uncomfortable. He questioned interpretations, challenged wording, and attempted to redirect attention toward older verbal understandings. But every argument ran into the same problem. The records were complete. Then came the first truly shocking discovery. Among the archive materials was a collection of communications showing that Michael had quietly corrected inaccurate ownership information years earlier after learning that misunderstandings were spreading among relatives. Rather than creating conflict, he simply updated records, preserved documentation, and moved forward. He never publicly confronted anyone. Instead, he prepared for the possibility that the truth might need to defend itself someday. When the attorney finished presenting the evidence, the room fell silent once more. Patricia looked genuinely stunned. Lauren seemed unable to process what she was hearing. Ryan stared down at the table. Then the attorney revealed one final detail. According to the archive inventory, there was still one unopened file remaining. Michael had marked it as the final review document and instructed that it should only be examined after all supporting evidence had been presented. Whatever was inside, Michael clearly believed it would answer the last remaining questions once and for all. The final review meeting took place 1 week later. By then, everyone understood that the outcome would depend not on opinions, family traditions, or personal expectations, but on evidence. The atmosphere inside the conference room was completely different from the first gathering. Nobody arrived with confidence anymore. Nobody spoke casually. The unopened file sat in the center of the table as if it carried its own weight. The attorney began by summarizing everything that had already been established. Ownership records, beneficiary designations, financial reports, and independent reviews all pointed in the same direction. The facts consistently supported Michael's documented intentions. Then he reached for the final file. For several seconds, nobody moved. Even Ryan seemed unwilling to interrupt. When the seal was opened, the attorney removed a single letter and several attached exhibits. The letter was written by Michael less than 6 months before his passing. Unlike his earlier notes, this one felt deeply personal. The attorney read it aloud. Michael explained that he had spent years trying to balance his love for his family with his responsibility to protect the truth. He acknowledged that misunderstandings regarding money had existed for a long time. He also admitted that he increasingly worried those misunderstandings would eventually place Emily in an unfair position if he were no longer there to clarify matters himself. As the letter continued, Michael revealed something none of us expected. Years earlier, after noticing repeated confusion regarding financial ownership, he hired independent professionals to perform a complete review of major assets connected to both his personal finances and family-related investments. The attached exhibits contained the results. Every ownership percentage, contribution amount, transfer record, and beneficiary designation had been independently verified. The findings left virtually no room for debate. The attorney carefully reviewed several key exhibits. One by one, long-standing assumptions collapsed. Assets that had been casually described as belonging to the family collectively were shown to belong primarily to Michael. Investment contributions that some relatives believed entitled them to larger claims were documented at much lower levels than expected. Updated beneficiary forms consistently reflected Michael's final wishes. Then came the most emotional part of the letter. Michael wrote directly to me. He explained that the purpose of all this documentation was never to punish anyone. It was to protect the people he loved from future conflict. He said he knew there might come a day when facts would need to speak for him. He thanked me for standing beside him through difficult years, for supporting his decisions, and for helping build the life we shared together. As those words were read aloud, I felt tears forming in my eyes. For weeks I had felt alone, questioned, and dismissed. Yet Michael had anticipated every step of this journey. He had trusted evidence to accomplish what he might not be able to explain himself. When the attorney finished reading, nobody spoke for a long moment. Patricia stared at the table. Lauren quietly wiped her eyes. Even Ryan seemed unable to argue with what had just been presented. The truth was no longer hidden inside files, boxes, or archives. It was sitting in front of everyone, fully documented, fully verified, and impossible to ignore. When the meeting finally concluded, there was nothing left to argue about. Months of assumptions had been replaced by documented facts, and years of uncertainty had been answered by the records Michael carefully preserved. The attorney completed his final review over the following weeks, and every major conclusion remained unchanged. Michael's wishes were clear. The ownership structures, beneficiary designations, and estate plans were honored exactly as he intended. For the first time since his passing, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. The constant pressure, the uncomfortable phone calls, the subtle attempts to influence decisions, and the endless suggestions that I should simply accept what others claimed was fair all disappeared. The truth had done its work. What surprised me most was not the outcome itself. It was how differently people behaved once uncertainty was removed. Patricia eventually asked to meet with me privately. We sat together in a small coffee shop on a quiet Saturday morning. She looked older than I remembered from only a few months earlier. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she admitted that she had relied on assumptions she believed were true. She confessed that she never imagined Michael had documented everything so carefully. More importantly, she acknowledged that she had underestimated both him and me. It was not a dramatic conversation. There were no raised voices and no grand speeches. Just two people facing a reality neither of us expected. Lauren later reached out as well. She explained that she had never fully understood the financial disputes and had simply followed the opinions of those around her. While we could not erase the tension of the previous months, we managed to rebuild a level of mutual respect. Ryan was different. He remained distant after the estate was finalized. Yet even he eventually stopped challenging the facts. There was nothing left to contest. Every question had already been answered. As for me, I stayed in the home Michael and I built together. Not because of its financial value, but because it held our memories. I replanted the flower beds we once worked on every spring. I repaired the backyard deck he always meant to finish. Little by little, life moved forward. One evening nearly a year later, I opened the leather notebook again and reread some of Michael's final entries. This time, I noticed something I had overlooked before. On one page, beneath a list of ordinary reminders and business notes, he had written a single sentence. It was simple enough to fit on one line. He wrote that truth requires patience because it often arrives later than emotion. I sat there for a long time thinking about those words. In the end, the greatest gift Michael left behind was not money, property, or financial security. It was clarity. He understood that people can disagree, memories can fade, and assumptions can grow stronger with time. That was why he trusted facts. That was why he preserved the evidence. And that was why, when everything was finally revealed, the truth spoke more powerfully than anyone else in the room ever could. Looking back now, I realize the story was never really about an estate. It was about a man who refused to let confusion replace reality and a final act of love that protected the person he cared about long after he was gone.